The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the water. It was the sound. A deep, hollow creak beneath my kitchen floor at 5:30 in the morning, the kind of sound an old house makes when it's trying to tell you something before disaster arrives. I remember standing there in my socks, coffee still brewing, staring toward the back window of my little farmhouse outside Ashford, Missouri, wondering why the ground looked darker than usual. Then I opened the basement door. And my heart nearly stopped. 3 inches of muddy water covered everything. My sewing room, my husband's old woodworking bench, boxes filled with photographs dating back to the 1960s, all floating, all ruined. I just stood there gripping the handrail, unable to move. For a few seconds I honestly thought maybe a pipe had burst during the night. Maybe the old water heater finally gave up after 20 years, but deep down something felt wrong, because this wasn't clean water. This wasn't household water. This looked like runoff, like creek water, like half the countryside had somehow found its way into my basement. My name is Evelyn Carter. Back in 1994, I was 53 years old, widowed, living alone on a 5-acre property I'd shared with my husband Frank before cancer took him 3 years earlier. That house wasn't just a house. It was every memory we built together, every Christmas, every birthday, every argument, every reconciliation. Everything. And somebody had just flooded it. At least that's what I suspected. At the time, though, I had no proof, only a bad feeling. A very bad feeling. Now, before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from and what year you bought your first home. I always enjoy reading those stories. And if you've ever dealt with a neighborhood association, county board, or somebody who thought power gave them permission to do whatever they wanted, make sure you're subscribed, because this one still makes my blood pressure rise 30 years later. That entire morning was chaos. I spent hours dragging soaked boxes upstairs, throwing away ruined carpeting, running fans, opening windows, trying not to cry. The photographs hurt the most. There were pictures of Frank in Vietnam. Pictures of our wedding, pictures of our daughter when she was little. Water doesn't just destroy paper, it destroys pieces of time. Around noon, I finally stepped outside to inspect the property. The previous week had been relatively dry. There hadn't been enough rain to justify what I saw downstairs, so I started walking the back fence line. And that's when I noticed it. A fresh channel carved through the earth. Not natural, not old, fresh. The dirt was loose. The grass was flattened. And the path ran directly from the neighboring development uphill from my property, straight toward my house. I followed it another 100 yards. The further I walked, the angrier I became, because I recognized exactly where that channel originated. The new retirement subdivision, Oak Hollow Estates. A development that had been expanding rapidly throughout the early 1990s. Nice homes, big entrance sign, fancy landscaping. And one very ambitious homeowners association president named Douglas Whitmore. Now, if you've never met a man like Douglas, consider yourself lucky. Douglas wasn't the kind of person who wanted authority. He wanted obedience. There is a difference. He had retired from some corporate management position in St. Louis and moved to Oak Hollow determined to run the neighborhood like his own private kingdom. Rules for everything, approvals for everything, committees for everything. Most people just rolled their eyes and ignored him. I couldn't, because Douglas and I already had history. A year earlier, he had tried convincing me to sell 2 acres of my land so the subdivision could expand a walking trail. I said no, politely, firmly. Repeatedly. Frank and I bought that land in 1972. I wasn't interested. Douglas never liked hearing no. And standing there looking at that fresh trench leading toward my basement, a memory surfaced that made my stomach tighten. 3 weeks earlier, I'd overheard him arguing with a contractor near the development entrance. I hadn't paid much attention at the time, but one sentence suddenly came back clear as day. We need that water moving somewhere else. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it meant everything. I crouched beside the trench and ran my fingers through the soil, fresh, recently disturbed, maybe a few days old, no more. Then I heard tires crunching gravel behind me. I turned. My neighbor Harold Jennings climbed out of his pickup. Harold had lived nearby longer than I had. Retired mechanic, good man, the kind who never spoke much unless something mattered. He stared at the trench, then he looked at me. You got water too, that word too, not you too, my pulse quickened. What do you mean too, Harold sighed. Lost part of my tool shed yesterday. I stared at him. Flooding, he nodded. Water came out of nowhere. We stood there silently for a moment. Two people looking at the same trench, thinking the same thing. Finally Harold kicked a clump of dirt with his boot. You know who ordered this, don't you? I did. I just wasn't ready to say it aloud. Neither was he, because accusing powerful people is easy. Proving it is another thing entirely. That evening clouds rolled across the Missouri sky. Heavy gray clouds. The kind farmers watch carefully. The kind that make your joints ache before the rain arrives. I sat on my porch drinking coffee and staring at that trench. Waiting. And around 7 o'clock the rain finally started. Not a storm. Not even heavy rain, just a steady shower, enough to test a theory. Within 20 minutes I had my answer. Water began flowing through the channel, then accelerating, then racing, not spreading naturally, not dispersing across the landscape, traveling with purpose, like somebody had built a highway for it, and every drop headed straight toward my basement. I watched the stream curve around a newly constructed berm near Oak Hollow's property line, a berm that hadn't existed a month earlier. Someone had reshaped the terrain, deliberately. Suddenly every piece clicked together. The flooded basement, the fresh trench, the redirected runoff, the old argument about my land, the timing, the motive, all of it. I wasn't looking at negligence. I was looking at retaliation. And standing there in the rain, soaked to the skin, watching muddy water rush toward the home Frank and I built together, I made a promise to myself. Douglas Whitmore had just picked the wrong widow, because I wasn't about to let this go. Not quietly. Not cheaply, and definitely not without a fight. The next morning I drove straight to Oak Hollow's association office, and that's where the real war began. The next morning I drove into Oak Hollow with a folder under one arm and a temper I was doing my best to keep under control. Back then, HOA offices weren't the polished little corporate spaces you see today. This one sat inside a converted ranch-style house near the subdivision entrance. Brown brick, faded shutters, and a sign that looked like somebody's nephew had painted it during a summer break. I walked in and found Douglas Whitmore exactly where I expected him, behind a desk. In control. Or at least pretending to be. He looked up over his reading glasses and smiled the way a banker smiles before denying a loan. Evelyn, Dalgas, to what do I owe the pleasure? I tossed 3 photographs onto his desk, pictures of my flooded basement. The smile disappeared for about half a second, then came right back. What happened? You tell me. He leaned back slowly. I'm not sure I understand. Of course he understood. Men like Douglas always understood. They just preferred pretending they didn't. I pointed toward the photographs. My basement flooded. That's unfortunate. Your drainage project caused it. There it was, the accusation. The room grew noticeably quieter. Douglas folded his hands together. Those are serious claims. So is flooding someone's house. His jaw tightened only slightly, but I saw it. The first crack. We recently completed some erosion control work. I know. It was approved. I didn't ask if it was approved. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Douglas stood and walked toward the window. The subdivision has experienced runoff issues. And your solution was to dump it downhill. His eyes narrowed. The terrain naturally directs water. I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was insulting. Douglas, I've lived on that property 22 years, he turned, and I've reviewed engineering recommendations. I looked him directly in the eye. Then show them to me. That caught him off guard. Not much, just enough. His confidence flickered, only for a second, but it was there. Then he recovered. I don't think that's necessary. Of course he didn't, because I was beginning to suspect those recommendations didn't exist. I left without another word. Arguing with people like Douglas was like wrestling with mud. You got dirty and the mud enjoyed it. What I needed wasn't a debate. I needed proof, real proof. That afternoon Harold stopped by with 2 coffees and a piece of information that changed everything. He'd spoken with one of the equipment operators who had worked on the drainage project. Apparently the crew had been hired in a hurry. No public notice, no community discussion, no county inspection. And according to the worker, Douglas personally supervised portions of the project. That was unusual, very unusual. Most HOA presidents don't spend their afternoons directing bulldozers. Control freaks do. For the next several days I became obsessed. I walked the property constantly, measured water flow after every rainfall, took photographs, recorded notes, filled entire notebooks. At night I'd sit at my kitchen table surrounded by maps, receipts, weather reports, and old property surveys while reruns of Murder, She Wrote played quietly in the background. The funny thing about getting older is people assume you'll slow down. Maybe that's true for some folks, but not all. Sometimes experience doesn't make you softer, it makes you harder to fool. 3 days later another storm rolled through, not severe, just steady rain, enough to test the system again. I watched from my back porch, and once again the water raced through the artificial channel, straight toward my property, straight toward my basement, like a guided missile. This time I had a camera ready. I filmed everything, every foot of that trench, every inch of water movement, every place the runoff crossed property lines. Then something interesting happened. The water didn't stop at my land. It continued towards several neighboring properties. By sunset my phone started ringing. First Harold, then another resident named Margaret, then Frank Dobbins, then 2 others. Everyone was experiencing flooding. Everyone lived downhill from Oak Hollow, and every story sounded almost identical. Water where there had never been water before. That wasn't coincidence anymore. That was a pattern. The following week I hired the one person Douglas never expected me to hire, a real engineer. His name was Richard Hensley, civil engineer, hydrology specialist, former Army Corps of Engineers consultant, the kind of man who looked at dirt for a living and somehow made it interesting. When Richard arrived, he spent less than 10 minutes examining the drainage trench before shaking his head. This wasn't done correctly. I folded my arms. How bad? He looked uphill, then downhill, then back at me. Worse than bad. Those 4 words felt surprisingly satisfying. For the first time someone qualified was confirming what I already knew. Richard spent the entire afternoon surveying the area, measuring elevations, testing soil, calculating runoff volume, taking photographs. By the end of the day he had enough information to fill half a filing cabinet. As the sun began setting behind the trees he approached me carrying a clipboard. "You're not going to like this." "What?" "I already don't," he nodded. "Good point." Then he pointed toward Oak Hollow. "They altered the grade. I figured." "No, you don't understand." He crouched and drew a rough sketch in the dirt. "This entire slope originally directed water into a natural drainage basin over there." He pointed west. "Then somebody built an earthen barrier." My stomach tightened. "The berm." "Exactly." He drew another line. "Once they blocked the natural route, the water had nowhere to go except here." He jabbed his finger toward my house. I stared at the sketch. The simplicity of it somehow made me angrier. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't complicated. Somebody literally moved dirt and changed where the water went. Richard continued. "In my professional opinion, this flooding was created by human intervention." Human intervention, such a polite phrase. A professional way of saying somebody caused this, on purpose. I took a slow breath. "Can you put that in writing?" He smiled. "Oh, absolutely." 3 days later his report arrived. 37 pages, photographs, survey maps, engineering diagrams, runoff calculations, county regulations, everything. And on page 29 sat the sentence I'd been waiting for. "The flooding affecting the Carter property is directly attributable to improper grading modifications performed on the adjacent development." Directly attributable. I must have read that sentence 20 times, maybe more. Because after weeks of being told, I was imagining things, exaggerating things, misunderstanding things. There it was, the truth, printed in black ink, official, professional, undeniable, or so I thought, because while I was celebrating my first real victory, Douglas Whitmore was preparing his next move, and it was far dirtier than flooding my basement. If I had learned one thing about Douglas Whitmore by then, it was this: the man never admitted defeat, not privately, not publicly. Not even when the evidence was sitting right in front of him. A week after Richard's engineering report arrived, Oak Hollow held its monthly HOA meeting. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Douglas wanted control of the narrative before the truth spread any further. The meeting took place inside the community recreation hall, a low brick building with fluorescent lights that always buzzed like angry insects. By the time I arrived, the room was packed. Homeowners filled nearly every chair. Some stood along the walls, others clustered near the back. Word had traveled, people were angry, people were asking questions, and for the first time in years Douglas looked nervous, not frightened, not yet, just uncomfortable, like a man who knew a storm was approaching but hadn't realized it was aimed directly at him. The meeting began with routine nonsense: landscaping updates, pool maintenance, holiday decorations, the usual distractions. Then Douglas cleared his throat. Before we continue, I'd like to address recent misinformation circulating within the community. There it was. Several people shifted in their seats. I remained silent. Douglas continued. Certain individuals have made accusations regarding our drainage improvements. Certain individuals, that was me. Apparently after flooding my home, he still couldn't bring himself to use my name. The board has reviewed these allegations and found no evidence of wrongdoing. I almost laughed. No evidence. I had 37 pages sitting in my briefcase. Then Douglas smiled, the same smug smile I'd seen a dozen times before. Our experts have concluded the flooding resulted from pre-existing homeowner maintenance issues. The room grew quiet, very quiet. I slowly stood. Which experts? Douglas froze, only for a second, then he recovered. The board consulted qualified professionals. Names? He didn't answer. Companies? Still nothing. The silence became uncomfortable. A man near the back raised his hand. I'd like to know too. Another homeowner nodded. So would I. Douglas looked annoyed. The room was slipping away from him. Then I opened my briefcase and removed Richard's report, 37 beautiful pages. The sound of the binder landing on the table echoed through the hall. People immediately leaned forward. I walked toward the front. You mean experts like this one? Douglas's face changed. For the first time since this nightmare started. I saw genuine fear, not anger, not irritation, fear. The room watched as I handed copies to several board members, then I addressed everyone. I hired an independent civil engineer. The room remained silent. He surveyed the site, more silence. He reviewed the grading, someone whispered. He mapped the runoff, more whispers. Then I delivered the line that changed everything. And he concluded the flooding was caused by Oak Hollow's drainage modifications. The room exploded. Questions flew everywhere. People started talking over one another. Several homeowners stood up. Margaret waved photographs of flooding behind her garage. Frank held up pictures of water damage near his workshop. Others began sharing similar stories. Douglas tried regaining control. Everyone pleased, nobody listened. The dam had finally broken, and once people stopped being afraid, authority becomes surprisingly fragile. One homeowner shouted, "Why weren't we told about the grading changes?" Another yelled, "Who approved this?" Then came the question Douglas couldn't answer. A retired accountant named Walter stood up and spoke calmly. "How much did this project cost?" The room fell silent. Douglas hesitated. "Too long, much too long." Walter noticed immediately. "How much?" Douglas shifted uncomfortably. The treasurer sitting beside him looked ready to disappear into the floor. Finally, Douglas answered. "Approximately $90,000. The room erupted again. $90,000. In the 1990s, that wasn't small money. That was serious money. Homeowners stared in disbelief. Walter blinked. $90,000. A woman near the front nearly dropped her notebook. "You spent $90,000 to flood people." That line spread through the room like wildfire. People repeated it, murmured it, shouted it. And suddenly the project had a nickname. The $90,000 flood. Douglas looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. But things got worse, much worse, because Richard wasn't finished. Without telling me beforehand, he had filed a formal report with county regulators, and apparently county officials had been paying attention. 2 weeks later, inspectors arrived. Not one, several county engineering staff, environmental compliance officers, stormwater specialists, people carrying clipboards and cameras, people who asked questions, lots of questions, questions Douglas couldn't answer. Questions the board couldn't answer, questions nobody wanted to answer. The investigation moved quickly, faster than anyone expected. Inspectors discovered permit issues, documentation issues, approval issues, record-keeping issues, and eventually they found something even more damaging. Douglas had bypassed multiple review procedures when approving the project. In plain English, he ignored the rules. The same man who spent years lecturing everyone else about regulations had ignored his own. The irony was almost beautiful. Over the next month the pressure intensified. County fines appeared. Legal notices appeared. Residents demanded special meetings. Homeowners demanded transparency. And for the first time in Oak Hollow's history, people stopped whispering behind closed doors. They spoke openly, publicly, together. Douglas couldn't control the conversation anymore. The community had already made up its mind. The final vote happened on a Thursday evening. I remember because it was raining. Ironically, soft, steady rain tapped against the windows while residents packed the recreation hall one last time. Douglas sat at the front table looking older than I remembered, not physically, emotionally. The confidence was gone, the certainty was gone, the arrogance was gone, only exhaustion remained. When the votes were counted, it wasn't close, not even remotely. Douglas Whitmore was removed. Several board members resigned shortly afterward. A completely new leadership team took over, and the first thing they did was approve a full corrective drainage project. Professional engineers redesigned everything. Contractors restored the natural water flow. Retention systems were added. Drainage channels were rebuilt. Protective barriers were installed. My basement was repaired. So were several neighboring properties. The total cost exceeded the original project by a substantial margin, a very expensive lesson. One entirely paid for by the people who caused the problem. Months later, I stood in my backyard after another major storm. Rain had fallen all afternoon. The kind of storm that once would have sent me running downstairs to check for water. This time I simply watched. The runoff followed its proper path. The drainage system worked perfectly. No flooding, no pooling, no surprises, just water going where nature intended. I stood there listening to the rain and realized something. The victory wasn't really about the money. It wasn't about the repairs. It wasn't even about Douglas. It was about refusing to accept something that was obviously wrong. Most people don't lose because they're weak. They lose because they get tired of arguing, tired of fighting, tired of being told they're imagining things. I almost gave up several times. If I had, none of this would have changed. The flooding would have continued. The truth would have stayed buried. And the people responsible would have walked away without consequences. Instead, they spent more than $90,000 fixing what should never have been broken in the first place. Today my basement is dry. The neighborhood is healthier. The HOA operates transparently. And every time a heavy rainstorm rolls through western Pennsylvania, I pour myself a cup of coffee, sit by the window, and smile. Because somewhere out there is a very expensive drainage system that exists for one reason and one reason only. Someone decided to flood the wrong homeowner. Now I want to hear from you. Was Douglas simply trying to protect his development and made a terrible mistake? Or do you think he knowingly sacrificed neighboring homeowners to save money? Have you ever dealt with an HOA, property manager, or local official who abused their authority? Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this real-life-style HOA drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because trust me, there is always another HOA story waiting around the corner.